So that's what I have largely used actually here for the for this lecture today. So hope people would find it useful. There are no other data sets, unfortunately, available, population-based. I mean, you might get micro-level studies here and there, but nationally representative population-based data indicators, we just don't have, unfortunately.
Yes, even with the advent of this COVID crisis, we found that even we don't have the data of population of migrants.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Condition for the policymaker also.
Yeah.
And finally, there are some institutions working, collecting data I found in Delhi, but I don't know what would be their aspects.
See, whatever data that was made available in real time was by government on COVID was not easily accessible, even for the researchers within the ministry, actually not going outside even. Lot of incomplete cells, missing cells, especially key variables like age and gender, no information. Then what do you make out of it actually? Very difficult to understand the dynamics.
So let's start today's session.
Sure.
And as usual, we are very much grateful to your kind presence here. So, dear and respected friends, we will start our session with an invocation of a song. So let me just share the.
So should I?
So, dear and respected friends, thank you so much for joining the day of our International Summer School. On behalf of Vishwaneedam Center for Self-Healing, welcome Professor Usha, Professor, Department of Biostatistics and Epidemiology, Chairman, Chairperson, Internal Committee, Institute, International for Population Sciences. It is deemed to be university. He is also General Secretary, Indian Association for Population Study. Along with all our participants, Professor Janjuli, Dr. General Anand, Mansi, so this international summer school is being nurtured by Nidhan Center for Asian Blossoming in collaboration with OK Minds, which is a social enterprise to promote mental health awareness and well-being to eliminate the stigma related to mental illness. And this lecture is also co-nurtured by Government Arts PG College, which is an autonomous college. Let me give a brief introduction to our Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming. It is a public intellectual trust, and we have so many projects, so many conferences we have organized, particularly after COVID-19. We have so many webinars, conferences, workshops related to research and we have three centers which we work in collaboration. One is Asian Forum for Social Theory, where we research and develop some theories related to theorization, Asiatic society. We have Gandhi Gopindu Center for Chittaranjan Studies and Global Learning, and we have Swadhyay Shastra for Learning Circle of Self and Mutual Studies. So let me talk about our whole International Summer School. We had first presentation by Dr. Anand P. Mali, and then we had two sessions devoted to understanding the very psychological dimension of old age issue and the problem. And then we had Dr. Tendulkar presentation yesterday. She presented and she tried to make us understand about the sociological dimension of the old age problem. and the challenges which contemporary society facing, particularly the crisis of old age population. So now we have with us Professor Usha, and she will be guiding us, she will help us to understand the old age problem so far as the population science is concerned. And she has expert in epidemiology, so her statistics and her knowledge will be helpful for us to understand and nuance understanding of it. So, Madam, over to you. You kindly present your presentation.
Thank you very much for a very nice introduction to the summer school and also about me. So it's an honor actually to be here this evening with all of you and share our some of the data that we have on aged population in India, and especially with respect to their health and well-being indicator. So what I'll do is I have prepared something like around 38, 39 slides. I'll go over the slides, but if you feel like stopping me in between and asking any question or anything, you are free to do that. I'm not going to make it a very formal lecture, but more of an interactive kind of a lecture. So you feel free to intervene anytime that you want to add anything or raise a comment or a query or a question. So I'm okay with that. So let me just go into the PowerPoint. Let me see if all of you can see my screen.
Yes, it is visible.
That's okay. Okay, good. So as he said, I'll be talking about state of health and well-being of elderly in India. And I'll be covering these broad areas, if possible, in today's discussion. We'll begin with the context and the data sources that I have used for my slides. Then we'll go into first indicators of health and then moving on to the well-being indicator. We'll begin with chronic health conditions, followed by symptoms-based health conditions, and also get into the direct health examinations in terms of biomarkers that were conducted to the aged population in the study. We'll then go into mental health, functional health, health behavior, and food availability of the elderly. Then try to have a little bit understanding on hospital care available to them and out-of-pocket expenditure and health insurance coverage among elderly. Also try to understand their living arrangement, how they feel about these living arrangements. Are they happy? Are they not happy? Or do they have the other choices and preferences and so on and so forth? Then we will discuss a little bit about their participation and connectedness with family and the other social support network. And briefly, we'll talk about ill treatment faced and discrimination faced by the elderly population, and also the social security schemes that they are aware of. So I'll try to cover these broad sub areas related to health and well-being of the elderly population. So, and I have taken the data from these three sources. I have taken data from United Nations population projections, which were undertaken in 2019. Then I have used some data from Indian censuses. And most of the indicators that I will be talking about today are taken from the longitudinal aging study in India undertaken by IAPS with the funding from Ministry of Health and Family Welfare and Social Justice. We have the results for wave 1. It's a longitudinal study as the name suggests. So the wave 1 results are out, which belong to the year 2017-18. So coming to the context, just to know what are numbers that we are looking for in terms of our elderly population. So globally, there are almost about 779 million elderly today in 2020 approximately, taken from the World UN population projections, of which 138 million are from India. And you can see that these numbers are going to grow substantially over the next 80 years, that is by the end of the century, both globally as well as for India. Then we look at the, let me remove this part here so that it becomes much better that subtitles and all that. Okay. Yeah. So if you look at the share of old age population in total population, both globally and for India. So I think right now, yeah. So if you look at these lines that I'm moving my cursor on, this gives us share of 60 plus and 70 plus population in terms of their absolute numbers. So on the left side, we have the numbers, and on the right side, we have their percent share. So in terms of absolute numbers, again, there are like 150 million elderly in 60 plus population globally, and in India, their share is about currently at nearly 12-13%, which is expected to increase substantially to almost 18% in future by the end of the century. Okay. Now, this I have just compiled the information related to 60 plus, 70 plus, 80 plus, and 90 plus population, how it is going to grow in India. The only point that I would want to highlight here, as you see, the overall share of India's population in the global population is eventually going to decline from 2040 onwards, where its share of India's elderly population, whether it is at 60 plus, 70 plus, 80 plus, even at 90 plus, is going to increase sharply, reaching to almost 16% by the end of the century. So who are these elderly? What are their basic characteristics? So if you look at, now this is from the LASI study that we have done for all India. So it's a nationally representative survey where we have covered all the states and union territories of India. So coming from that, our 60 plus population, 72% of male and almost 69% of female, they live in rural areas. Most of the men are currently married, that is 80+%, whereas women only 44% are married. Significant proportion of the elderly women in India are widowed, 54% as against 17% among men. And if you look at their living arrangements, so although majority are living with their spouse and children, mostly for men, women, this percent is very low. So that means elderly women, only 28% are living with their spouse and children, as against 54% among men. On the other hand, there are 41% of the elderly women who are living with their children and other relatives. So there is a differential in living arrangements of elderly, even by gender. If we look at the work status of the elderly population, so on the whole as a nation, about 38%, 36% of the elderly men and women are currently working. And if you look at their work in the past, so significant proportion, again 38% for both gender, higher for men, which is about 45%, as compared to 31% of female. They worked in the past, but currently not working. If we look at their economic status as measured by the MPCE quintiles, more number of elderly women belong to poorest quintile as compared to men. At the same time, more percentage of elderly women also belong to richest category as compared to men. So if you look at their economic activities that they are engaging in, majority of the women and men both are engaging in agriculture and allied activities. Higher percentage of elderly men are self-employed, 20% against 11%. And there are 18 to 20% of elderly men and women who are salary or the wage workers. Now, if we look at in terms of their status with respect to whether they are receiving any retirement benefits, so like pension, etc. So these red bars that you see, which are very high, shows that very, very high percentage of elderly women and men, they are neither currently receiving any pension or anything, nor are they expecting to receive any such benefits in future. So in general, what we see that our elderly are, relatively speaking, a very deprived population subgroup where the access to resources, I would say, are relatively lower as compared to the general population. Although general population figures I have not included here, but I can say with the comparison that I made in my larger presentation. So this Lassie survey asked a very straight question to the elderly as to how do they perceive their health. So in terms of self-reported health status, if you look at overall in India, 31% of men report, both elderly and men and women, they reported that their health was in good condition, whereas there were 24% who perceived their health to be bad. And there are variation by whether you take the urban-rural residents, whether you take by gender or their marital status, or in terms of their living arrangement, their work participation, or economic status that they belong to. Usually, higher percentage of men perceived themselves to be in good health as compared to female, and also those who were living with others or alone, percentage share of those perceiving their health as a poor health was much higher than compared to the other categories, those either staying with spouse and children or with spouse and others. So coming to the now chronic health conditions, I have taken these three subgroups here: general health problems, chronic health conditions, and organ-related diseases. So we see here information related to hypertension, heart disease, stroke, CVDs, diabetes, high cholesterol, anemia, asthma, bronchitis, COPD, or any chronic lung diseases. So what we see, only 2-3 points that what I would highlight. If we look at hypertension and CBDs, these two are most common problem in both men and women, and relatively higher prevalence among female population as compared to male population. When it comes to diabetes, prevalences are high, and there is no gender difference really. They are more or less similar for both men and women. Similar is the case with asthma and also any chronic lung diseases. Now, if we look at the arthritis and other related diseases that have included here, including bone joint problems and so on and so forth. So you see that the issues again related to whether it is the bone or joint problem or arthritis or rheumatism. They are more among the elderly women than they are among the elderly men. So women are always disadvantaged when it comes to most of these prominent health conditions, chronic health conditions. Other diseases I have also included here. I don't know if I'm able to get rid of this lower panel. How do I move it? Okay, now you can see. So we have also got information here on other neurological problems, Alzheimer's, psychiatric problems, depression, any neurological or psychological problems. Prevalences are lower, but they are significant minorities in terms of their numbers, right? And there are no gender differences in these kind of health conditions. So now we have issues related to thyroid disorder, gastrointestinal problem, skin diseases, chronic renal failure, kidney stones, incontinence, and any urogenital problems. So again, you see a gender divide in any urogenital conditions. No differences in terms of gastrointestinal problems. It's more or less similar for both men and women. More common diseases are gastrointestinal here and any urogenital problems. Also, you have issues related to eye problem. More than half of the elderly face any eye problem, which in most prominent is refractive errors and cataract. Then we have issues related to hearing or ear issues. About 10% of elderly reporting these health conditions. Dental caries among about 20%. Then we have another important one is about oral health issues, quite prominent, partial or complete, both in more than 80% population of elderly. Now we have, in terms of general overall burden of morbidity. So there are about half of the elderly who did not report any morbidity, whereas there were 29% who reported at least one morbidity condition of the ones that I listed earlier. There were 23% of the elderly who had 2 or more health conditions in general. And again, these percentages are slightly higher for female elderly, especially for 2 or more health conditions. Okay. Excellent. Now we move on to the symptom-based health conditions, where we have included injuries and faults, endemic diseases, and women's health. So if you look at anything related to pain, sleep problems, again, there is a gender divide where women are suffering more than the men. If you look at the injury, falls, also again, elderly women are disadvantaged as compared to males. If we look at permanent physical disability, there is no gender divide. Psychological problems, there is no gender divide. Chronic illness, there is no gender divide. When we look at the any health problems, slightly higher for elderly men than for elderly women. Okay. Now we have diagnosed endemic diseases, that is among 60+ population. So if you look at waterborne diseases, 20% of women and 19% of men, they reported waterborne diseases, and diarrhea was most common, followed by typhoid and jaundice hepatitis. Among vector-borne disease, about 10 to 11% of the elderly, they suffered from a vector-borne disease, and malaria was most common, followed by chikungunya and dengue. Other infections also were reported by about 4% of elderly. Another 3% reported urinary tract infections, and about 1% reported tuberculosis. So about more than a quarter of the elderly had any endemic disease. Now we look at the women selected indicator only. We have got 4 information here with respect to genital prolapse, uterine fibroid cyst, any reproductive health problems, hysterectomy. So about 16% of the women who were surveyed 60+, they have reported suffering from any reproductive health problem, and hysterectomy was done by almost 10% of them. Then the survey also did direct health examination for following conditions. They measured blood pressure, lung functions, visual acuity, anthropometry measures, and grip strength. So just few selected indicators is what I have compiled here. Okay. So if you look at percentage of elderly who reported pre-hypertension condition was about 39%. About 36% had high blood pressure. 35% of these have mild or moderate hypertension, and 1% had a severe hypertension. Then we look at the, Then we look at the status of hypertension. So there were about 22% of the elderly who had undiagnosed hypertension, which is defined as hypertension by a health professional, diagnosed with the hypertension by a health professional, and currently measured also in the survey with hypertension, but currently not taking any treatment. No, sorry, I read the wrong one, sorry. Undiagnosed hypertension is by a health professional whose measured systolic BP was less than 140 and diastolic was less than 90. So about 17% of elderly, and this was higher among the female, had controlled hypertension, and uncontrolled hypertension was reported by about 15%, once again higher by the female elderly population. About 10% of the elderly did not treat their hypertension condition, so they were untreated, whereas about 36% of them were under treating, not regularly taking the treatment or on and off taking the medications kind of things. About 42% only were taking adequate treatment. Yes, please.
Sorry to actually, I cannot see your slide. Only one slide that is constant, that is self-report prevalence.
They are not moving?
No, they are not moving. So you can,
reshare?
Just reshare.
Okay.
Stop and again reshare this.
Oh, okay. But you should have pointed it out earlier. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
No, I'll
only
stop sharing.
2 or 3 slides.
Okay. So where is this? Stop sharing.
Yes, it has been stopped.
Okay, so I'll share
you can
again.
Share. Yes, share the screen.
Okay, you can see now.
Yes, I can see measured BP oblique hypertension. Yes,
okay, so which slide you want me to go with?
Yes, 16. Yes.
So were you able to see the symptom-based health
Yes,
conditions?
Yes, symptom-based.
Okay, so I'll skip it. What about direct examination biomarkers? Were you able to see this measured BP?
Yes.
Okay.
No visible, it is visible.
Okay, so which one should I begin now?
BP, I think.
Okay, so I'll go into the slide mode. Okay. Now you can see it?
Yes. It is
okay, visible. So you tell me if you are unable to see, right? Okay, so let me repeat then here. So about 40% of the elderly, that is 60 plus population in the survey, they found to be under pre-hypertension status, and 36% had high blood pressure. Of those 36%, 35% actually had mild or moderate hypertension, whereas 1% had severe hypertension. Okay, so this is the first thing. Then what's the problem? Okay, now with respect to the treatment, what was the status of this diagnosed hypertension? So about 22% hypertension cases were undiagnosed, in the sense these elderly did not know that they had hypertension. It was only known to them when the survey team diagnosed them with the hypertension. Before that, they did not know that they had a hypertension. About 17% of the elderly, they had a controlled hypertension, which means that they knew that they, which was told to them by a health professional, that their systolic and diastolic hypertensions, blood pressure were on the higher side, slightly on the higher side, under grade 1. And about 15% of them, and slightly more again among women, were uncontrolled hypertension cases. Most of these 10% did not treat for hypertension, although they had the hypertension condition, and about 36% they were undertreated, in the sense they were not taking regular treatment. On and off they would take the medication, but not a regular medication for that hypertensive status. Whereas 42% of taking adequate treatment on regular basis. And there are gender divide, as I said, both in terms of the prevalence of hypertension and also their treatment status. Then we looked at the lung diseases. So we see that about 4% of the elderly had mild obstructive lung diseases, and another 6% had about moderate or severe obstructive lung diseases. Low vision was prevalent in about 37% of the elderly, higher on the female elderly, and blindness was about 4%. Okay, and cutoffs and all that I have given in the slide, so I don't want to repeat that. These are standard WHO cutoffs that are followed in the study. Then if we look at the waist body mass index, so about 27% of elderly, slightly higher among men, were underweight, and 17% were overweight. 6% of the elderly, which is higher in the female population actually, were obese. 21% of the elderly had low risk waist to hip ratio, and 79% had high risk waist to hip ratio. In terms of grip strength, the dominant grip strength was 24 kg for men, and 16 kg for women. And for non-dominant hand grip strength, it was 22 and 14 kg for men and women elderly respectively. Now coming to the mental health, and where we have taken cognition and depression. So they have constructed an indicator for cognition, and which has covered 6 domains, which are memory, orientation, retrieval frequency, arithmetic function, executive function, and object naming. So based on that, they found that about 15% of the elderly, they belong to lowest 10th percentile. And this percent was substantially higher for the female elderly, 22% as against of 7% among men. Now, if you look at the word recall, just I have taken these 4 parameters only here. Word recall, higher percentage of elderly women were unable to recall the words. There was no gender difference when it came to orientation with respect to time and place. Verbal frequency, again, did not have a gender divide. About 11% of the elderly had issues with verbal fluency. Arithmetic function was a problem for about 4%. So there are significant minorities of the elderly who had suffered this cognition status. Now, if you look at the depressive symptoms, about 30% of the elderly nationally reported depressive symptoms, and it was slightly higher among rural elderly and among female population. If we look at the gradient by education, it shows a very negative association, meaning that the better educated elderly had lower depressive symptoms as compared to the elderly who were low or no schooling. Then if we look at the self-reported prevalence of diagnosed depression versus episodes of depression that they have experienced in last 1 month, if I recall the time period that they have taken in the study, almost 9% of the elderly had issues with respect to, and this is all with the living arrangement, that scale is missing, sorry, but it is for the living arrangement. So those who are living with children and others, they reported higher, and those living alone, they reported higher. And these are the ones who are living in the institutional setup, again reported higher depression. Now coming to their functional health, I have included physical and mental impairment, mobility restrictions, work limiting health conditions, activities of daily living, use of aids and supporting devices for ADLs, instrumental activities of daily living, and helpers if they are using any helper for completing the tasks. So if you look at the prevalence of any impairment, About 11% of elderly had reported any impairment, and locomotor impairment was the most prominent, followed by visual and mental and hearing impairments. And again, there were no gender divided by for these indicators. If we look at the work limiting health conditions, so 35% of the elderly, they reported they had problem in walking 100 yards. If there 41% had problems for sitting for long hours, 44% had problem getting up after sitting for long hours in the same position. 57% reported issues with climbing without resting. 58% reported having problem issues with stooping, kneeling, or crouching. 21% had problem with extending arm above shoulder levels. 53% with pulling, pushing large objects. 40% is having concerns with lifting, carrying heavy weights, and 10% having to pick up a coin. So about 29% of the elderly on the whole had a work limiting health condition. If you look at the ADLs, so 7% had problem in dressing, 8% had problem in walking across rooms, 7% have problems in bathing, 8% in have eating difficulties, 12% in getting in or out of bed, 18% reported difficulty in toilet use, 14% had 2 or more ADL problems. If we look at the hearing aid, about 1% were using hearing aid, 38% were using spectacles or contact lenses, dentures were used by 3% of the elderly, aids for physical disability, about 10% were using. So overall, 43% of the elderly, slightly higher among men, were using any aid or supporting device to carry out their ADL. Now coming to the IADLs, so 18% had problem in preparing meals, 24% had problem in shopping, making telephone calls, etc., 29%, taking medication, about 16%, doing gardening, managing their day-to-day active work, about 27-28%, getting around unfamiliar places, 30% face problem. 2 or more IADLs faced by 37%. One common thing you note here is that regardless of the IADL activity, it was problems, elderly women were facing more problem than the elderly men in carrying out IADLs. Now coming to health behavior and food availability. So if you look at percentage of elderly who were smoking, who are currently smoking, 26%, much higher among men than women, 28% versus 18%. 28% of the elderly were using smokeless tobacco. 5% of the elderly men, they were frequent non-heavy drinker, and 5% were with a heavy episode drinking. In female, about 3% were current smokers, and about 16% were using smokeless tobacco. Drinking and frequent drinking was much less, 1% among the female. If you look at those who were practicing yoga, so about 11% of elderly nationally, they were doing yoga at least more than once a week. This was higher in urban areas and among men. About 6% of the elderly nationally reported that they reduced the size of their meal as they were unable to afford. This percentage was substantially higher in rural areas, about 77%. And there were no gender difference, male, female, with respect to reduced size of meal. However, you do see that about another 5% of the elderly who reported that they were hungry, but they did not eat. This was higher again in rural areas. There were 3% of the elderly who reported that they did not eat any meal for the whole day. Again, higher in the rural areas. If we look at these risk behavior or the practices with respect to yoga, you see that there is a great gradient with living arrangements of the elderly or with their economic status. For example, you see that about 14% of the elderly who actually are living with spouse and children are practicing yoga at least more than once a week. This is the highest, which goes down to 6% and 8% among those who are either living alone or living with others who are non-relatives. Then if you look at the reduced size of the meal, those who are living alone, much higher percentage reported that they reduced their size of meal, and equal percentage of elderly reported that they were hungry, but they did not eat among those who were living alone, and also who did not eat for the whole day. So these percentages are higher among those who are either living alone or living with non-family members, non-spouse and others. So likewise, you see a gradient that the practices with respect to yoga improve as the economic status of the elderly improve from the lowest to the best, that is the poorest to the richest. The reduced percentage of the elderly who reduced their meal size or went hungry or did not eat for the whole day, it declines as the economic status improves. That meaning that those in the poor economic status, higher percentage tend to reduce their meal size. They don't eat when they are they are not eating when they are hungry, or they skip the meal for the whole day. Now, if you look at the hospital care and out-of-pocket expenditure and health insurance coverage. So I have not prepared the figures here because it became too lengthy. So what I have done is just took out the key findings from the study, what is reported in the report. So nationally, 27% of the elderly received inpatient care from the public health facility, and 72% they go to the private health facility, and this is for the last 1 year prior to the survey. Elderly are more likely to receive outpatient care from public health facilities. This is 63% against 23% as compared to the public health facility. 54% of the elderly were hospitalized for non-communicable diseases. This was followed by 31% for the communicable diseases and 12% for maternal health problems and other diseases. The mean out-of-pocket expenditure for the last inpatient care in public facility is about 8,000 Indian rupees and 32,000 in a private. So 8,000 is in the public health facility. The mean expenditure on outpatient care during the last 30 days is about Indian rupees 1,100, significantly higher among urban males, currently married, living with the spouse and children, and economically affluent. Poor health insurance coverage is what is seen among the elderly. 1/5 of the elderly covered under any health insurance at the national level. Coverage was more for men and those who were currently working at the time of survey, and most of them were covered under the RSBY scheme, about more than 85% actually. Now, if you look at the living arrangement and the satisfaction with respect to current living arrangements, living arrangement with the spouse and children was what was the most preferred living arrangement as reported by the elderly. 6% of the elderly and 9% of the elderly women, though as we saw earlier, were living alone. So that means most of them were not able to live in the environment that they prefer to live in actually. Around 75% of the elderly were satisfied with the current living arrangements, although this percentage was higher in urban areas and among those who were divorced, separated, or deserted, or were living alone. 5% of the elderly expressed their intention to change their living arrangements in future if they were given choice. Now, when it comes to social and family connectedness and social support, 82% of the elderly living with a spouse share their personal matter with the spouse, followed by their children or grandchildren, if they have one. 92% have grandchildren, and 1/5 look after them. So the elderly are actually the care provider for the grandchildren. Average hours of care provided to grandchildren is about 18 hours per week. And this was more among women, because women elderly, they spend more time for grandchildren care than the men. The main reason for caring grandchildren are that the preferred caregivers, that they are considered as the preferred caregivers. And because their parents are working, so the elderly find it their moral responsibility to take care of their grandchildren. 15% of the elderly received financial support from their family members from family members or friends in the past 1 year. At the same time, about 6% of the elderly reported that they actually provided financial support to others, including their family members. More than 2% of the elderly have family members who are unable to carry out basic daily activities such as eating, dressing, taking bath, etc. So they have to also work as a care provider to these family members who are unable to take up their ADLs. Now, in terms of their decision-making and community participation, with declining financial power and functional abilities, many of the elderly are left out of family decision-making processes. 1 in 10 elderly women reported no role in decision-making on marriage age in the family. 15% were reported that they had no decision-making participation in buying or selling property. 20% had no decision-making or participation on decisions related to education of a family member. Only 5% of the elderly reported lower social or community participation. So there are a substantial proportion of elderly who have reported experiencing ill treatment, discrimination, and life satisfaction. About 5% of the elderly nationally reported that they experienced ill treatment in the past 1 year, and that was most frequent amongst women elderly. More than 3/4 of these experienced were verbal or emotional ill treatment. A 1/5 faced physical ill treatment, and a 1/3 were victims of economic exploitation. Caregivers are reported to be the primary abuser of the elderly. 2/5 of the elderly are ill-treated by sons or daughters, that is about 41%, followed by son-in-law or daughter-in-law, 36%. This leads to the victim's sense of helplessness and makes them reluctant to report the incidents because the perpetrators are mainly their own children or their daughter or son-in-laws. 7% of the elderly reported facing day-to-day discrimination, and most of them found it because of attributed it to the age, followed by financial status. Another 14% perceived religion or caste affiliation as the reason for discrimination. About 46% of the elderly reported a high level of satisfaction in their life. Now, when it comes to awareness of social security schemes for the elderly, it is relatively low. 55% of the elderly knew about old age pension scheme. So there are a number of schemes the government of India has launched for the welfare of the elderly population nationally. And there are many states which also have state policies and programs for the welfare of elderly. 44% of the elderly knew about widow pension scheme. 12% of the elderly knew about Annapurna scheme. Awareness was higher among rural elderly population than the urban elderly population. A 1/3 of the rural BPL elderly population received old age pension benefits, and 24% received widow pension scheme benefits. Main reason for not using the social security schemes are reported as cumbersome enrollment process, reported by about 35% of elderly, or not having required documents. Over a third of widow pension scheme beneficiaries reported that there is a considerable delay in receiving the money under the scheme. About a quarter of the elderly are aware of concessions in train, bus, and airfare, travel, telephone connections, special interest rates for bank accounts, loans, and income tax benefits. Only 12% of the elderly are aware of Maintenance and Welfare of Parents and Senior Citizen Act of 2007 in India. Thank you very much. I'll stop here. And if you have any comment or query, I'll be more than happy to take it up.
Thank you so much, madam. And really, it was very enriching data to whatever the learning we have come across last 4 days. And it really depicts your data's concern and also our theory concern. So it was very enriching session. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And since we have limited of time, because this session is only for 1 hour, so I request respected participants to kindly brief in their question.
Sure.
So first, I would like to invite Militi.
Hello, am I audible? Yeah,
Yes,
I'm on the road. Yeah, I'm on the road. Thank you, madam, so much. I mean, for the very details data. And actually, in all these
Your voice is
parameters.
echoing, please. Your voice is echoing. I can request.
Yeah, okay. Then let me stop. Randhiri, you can continue because I have to board the train.
Yes, you can, type in the chat box.
You can put in the chat box. If I can take the question, no problem.
Yes, respected friend, Dr. Gyan Gului.
Yes, thank you very much. It was really very interesting. I am here seeing on my notes. The question which I would like to put is this one, that is, it is to be registered an evolution in the data, that is, there are bettering, or there are points which are worsening, or points which are remained equal. This is the first question which came to my mind.
So this is only one-time data, right? So you can only assess it at the time of survey. There is no other data that I can take from the past where I can see how things are improving or deteriorating, because we just don't have that indicator as of now. However, when the second wave data comes 3 years down the road, we should be able to see if there is a progress or a deterioration. But with the current data, we can only look at the current scenario and then see how they vary by gender, for example, or by various other socio-economic profile of these elderly. So it's only one-time situational analysis that we will be able to. But going with the, let us say, micro level studies that are available in India on elderly, small scale studies, it is very difficult to say honestly whether things have improved or deteriorated. Reason being because we just don't know whether some of the changes could be because of improvement in reporting itself. In large scale surveys, what we are able to do is we are able to create a standard questionnaire and canvas that through with the trained investigators who implement it across the units in a same standard manner, give a lot of time to get the information, which may not really happen in the micro studies, to be very honest. So the comparisons becomes difficult. It's very difficult for me to say that things have improved because I just don't have the evidence for it.
Thank you. Surya ji, and then Mansi, Jaya ji. If not, then we are also have some Sarandeep. So I think we should wind up this session. It was very, very insightful. And thank you so much for your generosity and very, very excellent deliberation. And your data really will help us in further understand and all these details about all these problems and issues.
Yeah.
So
Thank you very
so
much for having me. And if anyone is interested, I can share my PPT with anyone who would want to know, or even the data set is available in public domain. So if anybody is interested, as Minati mentioned, that they will be able to do a lot of micro level analysis. Yes, the data set is available in public domain. So feel free to get access to data. You can reach out to IIPS to get the data and the reports and everything. So yes, you can use it, or even the PowerPoint, as I said. If anybody wants, I can always share that. Not a problem.
thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much.
And
बहुत-बहुत
namaste.
धन्यवाद. Good night.
Thank
Namaskar.